Under the Speaker's announced policy of January the 3rd, 2017, the Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, for 30 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, let me just note, I believe that our President is doing a terrific job. I think that the last presidents of the United States have left us an incredibly dangerous situation, and this president's trying to deal with it with strength and purpose, and yes, being a forceful leader. For example, during the Clinton administration, we provided $4 to $5 billion to North Korea. Same way the last administration tried to provide funds for Iran. And what do we have now as a crisis with possible nuclear weapons and missiles in North Korea? That's called kicking the can down the road, and they sure kicked it down to us. And now people want to kick the can down the road with the Iranians. No, let's not do that again and leave future generations to face the music that we left them. Our president wants to make sure that Iran does not become a nuclear power as long as it is controlled by radical, fanatic mullahs who don't even represent their own people. And in fact, if Iran was a more peaceful, was actually more democratic, we wouldn't have to worry about that because they wouldn't want to have a wasteful program of nuclear weapons. Well, those are the type of the issues that we face today. We face a lot of uncertainties at home and abroad, and it behooves us to look for explanations for the shifts in power and the dangers and the influence that are taking place in the world today. Europe, along with the United States, for 5 decades seemed to be the center of world order and progress. NATO, the European Union, the common market, all seemed to be the epitome of sophisticated and proper governance needed to offset humankind's destructive and combative inclinations. World War I and World War II had undercut, if not destroyed, the expansion of classical liberalism that was in the process of retiring royalist and imperialist domination of the world, which, of course, that's where the world was at the turn and the beginning of the 20th century as classical liberalism began to replace imperialism and monarchy. Well, yes, the two world wars that we experienced were traumas that still impact our lives. The Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I, it was the last gasp of European colonialism. Maps drawn at that international gathering brought on World War II and the plague, and that does plague us to this day, some of those other lines that they drew on that map. Those national borders mandated by the Versailles Treaty made the world temporarily tranquil. Haven't we heard that about? Maybe we just heard about that a few moments ago, how we've got to overcome the tragedy right now, like we did in Korea, by not making the confrontations with those people who are engaged in hostile activity. Yes, the Treaty of Versailles gave the world temporary tranquility, but doomed following generations to instability and conflict. Such future challenges were left to the League of Nations, and when that failed, the baton was passed to the United Nations. Humanity obviously hoped that global government in one form or the other would solve everything. The EU, the common market, and NATO, and other multinational bureaucracies would demonstrate how nation states can cooperate and achieve a collective peace and freedom and prosperity. Well, just as things changed dramatically after the 19th century, and when it turned into the 20th century, it became a totally different world. So too, our world is changing, and we must make sure that we have turned from the 20th century into the 21st. The 20th century was dominated by the wars and by the defeat of the Soviet Union. Yet, we are plagued with conflicts and upheavals that can be traced back to border and sovereign decisions made long ago by people who are now dead, not only from the 20th century, but as I said, from the end of World War I. Many of the confrontations between various nationalities that we face today could be solved, and the greatest threats of violence, insurrection, and war itself could be diffused if our world would again recognize the right of self-determination. It seems to have been forgotten that the United States was not only founded on the principle of liberty and independence, but also the right of people to demand their rights, and yes, that right of independence. They had a right to declare their independence. This was the revolutionary idea that people have a right to select their government. And this was the revolutionary idea that gave our founding fathers and mothers the moral high ground and to free themselves from the British Empire. Without this, they probably would not have won if it was just a battle between power mongers. No, this was what the fundamental beliefs were in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but also the right of people to declare themselves free and independent, to create a country based on shared beliefs and shared ideals and values. This is what we hope. Those shared values and those beliefs in liberty and justice, we hope that those are the things that unite us today. And that's what united our founding fathers and mothers, and that's what made us a nation. After all, we don't have one race or one religion or one ethnic group to identify us as being Americans and create that unity. But that said, there are many other countries of the world whose nationalism and patriotism are based on the fact that they have an identity with other people that share their cultural and their racial identities. Now, this is what unites them as a people. They are ethnically the same. They are culturally the same. And they have the same type of national and racial roots in their past. Yes, this is what most countries are like. That's what defines a nationality. Recognizing that people of similar values and culture do not want to live in the subjugation of others has been ignored and or rejected by the powers that be throughout the world. So we live in a world where this idea of just recognizing that people want to be like people with similar people, and people who are, for example, you have differences between Catholics and Protestants in many areas of the world. And yeah, they'd like to have people who maybe speak their same language and have the same culture, enjoy the same music. There's nothing wrong with people identifying others as being part of their national family. Well, we should promote that as a positive rather than as a negative. We should encourage people to work together, and there are many, for example, Jewish charities, which is wonderful that Jewish people now, because they've gone through a certain amount of oppression throughout the world, they take care of each other in Jewish charities. We have that. We had Catholic schools and different things. Yes, it's meant because people do share certain values that they can work together on, and that's a good thing. And however, the idea that people like that might want to be in their own country, which is what our founding fathers said, because it was only shared values, it wasn't specific. We wanted freedom of religion for all people. Well, today, the world is threatened by people who want to be independent of domination of others who don't share their same values and their nationality. Well, the reason why it's being rejected basically by the power brokers throughout the world, because it threatens those in power with losing authority over people who don't want to live under their domination. That's what self-determination is all about, letting people decide their own fate, because if a majority of people in an area want to be independent of a country, that's what they should be, according to our Declaration of Independence. And this is something that brings a more peaceful world rather than trying to have subjugation of one people by another. there has been a major cause of conflict, and this whole in the world today, when people don't recognize that, yes, there are others who feel that they are being oppressed by being forced under the jurisdiction of a particular government, and they would like to have their own independence. This has, of course, been especially true where people, since the end of the Cold War, have started looking at their own self-identification. When the right of self-determination is recognized, disputes are usually settled peacefully, as happened when, for example, after the fall of communism, the Czechs and the Slovaks, who had one country before, under the Treaty of Versailles, the Czechoslovakia became the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. Well, that's fine. That's a good thing that they were able to separate, and now they can be friends. But the Czechs and the Slovaks, when they were in one country, the Slovaks felt like they were being oppressed, they weren't satisfied. It was a good thing to permit them, right off the bat, if you don't want to be part of a country with us, yes, you can be a separate country. Otherwise, there would have been turmoil at one level or another. We also saw a peaceful solution in countries like Slovenia. You know, Yugoslavia was breaking up, Tito was dead, the Cold War was over, and guess what? Slovenia and a bunch of these other republics within Yugoslavia wanted to be independent, and they were able to do it. Well, perhaps they were able to do it because the Serbs had already launched attacks on the Croatians and the Kosovars and other people in Yugoslavia that now was splitting apart because these people wanted to be independent and free, but the Serbs attacked them, and they didn't attack Slovenia because I think by that time they realized they could not succeed at going to war with all of these various groups. Well, had the Kosovars and the Croatians been free to just go and separate and become independent countries, as Croatia is today, and as the Kosovars would like to be, and as we're trying to help them be, well, that would have been better for Serbia. It would have been better for everybody. There would have been probably by now an agreement for some kind of free trade zone, but instead, when the Serbs used force to keep those people under its jurisdiction, we had violence throughout the Balkans that have lasted for several decades. That's a tragedy. And we should be working today in the Balkans. And let me just note, the Serbs today are much more, not much more, they are an example of people who are reaching out, for example, to the Kosovars and others to try to find peaceful solutions and try to come to some agreements that will make peace more likely. But again, if you would have had people who were under their thumb, nobody would be talking to them because they'd be afraid of them. No, people who treat other people as equals and rights as people in the world, they are more likely to reach understandings that are of mutual cooperation that will bring peace to the world, not trying to say you have to submit yourself to some other group of people. In the former Soviet Union, the Ukraine and other of the so-called Soviet republics were permitted at the end of the Cold War to basically peacefully establish their own independence. And I know it's not as simple as that, but it happened in a peaceful way in which thousands of lives were not lost, trying to force groups of people who do not want to be under Moscow's control, and those people, and whether they're Ukraine or elsewhere in the Baltics or the Balkans, those people had the right, and also in Central Asia, people were permitted to have basically an independent government free from being only suppressed by Moscow and have to follow its orders. That happened relatively peacefully. Had that not happened, there probably would be conflict throughout that part of the world today. There certainly would have been as communism faltered in Russia itself. So it took a lot of prodding for us to make sure that the Russians in the Soviet Union, in Moscow, understood that they could not keep people under their thumb. And it was the Cold War, and thank God we ended the Cold War peacefully, because that was the great gift that Ronald Reagan gave to us. and I'm very proud to have served with Ronald Reagan for 7 years in the White House as a senior speechwriter to the president for 7.5 years, as well as being a special assistant to the president, and very involved with his efforts to try to promote peace in the world. And a lot of it was peace by recognizing people's right to independence. Looking forward to it, if we look back, for example, Ronald Reagan was an Irish American. Look at the needless violence that the British perpetrated and that happened in Ireland because the British insisted that the Irish be kept under British rule for so long, when it was clear that the Irish people wanted to be independent of Great Britain. Look at what happened in contrast in Singapore and Malaysia, where the British just peacefully permitted those countries that were basically under the domination. They were part of the Great Britain and the British Empire. They were permitted to just leave and establish their independence peacefully. And then, Malaysia and Singapore became not part, they separated from Great Britain, and then they separated from each other peacefully. But in any one of these cases, if somebody demanded that these people stay in this particular status within this particular government, there would have been violence, a lot more violence. When self-determination is respected, peace is more likely. When a people are subjugated to the orders of a government in a country they don't want to be part of, violence is more likely. How easy is that? But special interests and power elites throughout the world are not so inclined to this obvious reasoning. And why? Because it's not in their interest to permit people just to go when they have them right there under their control. So let's look at a few examples where self-determination is manifested itself or in conflict. Today, one of the great conflict areas of the world is the Middle East. Again, most of the, or not of most, but many of the conflicts that we see, if not a majority, can be traced right back to the Treaty of Versailles, right back to World War I and the decisions of colonialists and imperialists and royalists to draw borders in the Middle East, just as they did in Africa and elsewhere, that made no sense. And yes, we ended up separating whole nations. For example, one nation of people that we are aware of today are the Kurds. The Kurds were separated into various countries by the Treaty of Versailles, by these British and French colonialists, and we are supposed to just abide by their decision of what the borders should be today, 100 years later? No, I don't think so. The Kurds, of course, were not living just subjugating themselves to what they have been dictated. No, the Kurds have been our greatest ally in the fight against radical Islamic terrorism. And what they are doing today and what they just voted on recently was that they had a vote to determine if their people wanted self-determination and wanted to be an independent country from Iraq. Yes, that was a good thing, and we should recognize that. They won overwhelmingly, and that we should look at the map we should say, a map of the Middle East needs to be changed so you can have a Kurdistan that flows all the way from Turkey and Iraq and Iran and Syria. There are more, for example, Kurds in Iran than there are in Iraq. In Turkey, there are more Kurds, and of course in Syria. This should be a modern country. Why are we letting this turmoil go on when our greatest allies are looking for their own self-determination and these other countries are becoming or already are our enemies? Yes, it will behoove the United States to support the independence of Kurdistan, and all the Kurds we should support in bringing together these Kurdish people as a nation, because that's what they are. They're a nation without a state. Let them have their country. There's been so much bloodshed in trying to repress the Kurds from the Iranians, from the Mullah regime, but also the Shah before him. The Kurds were oppressed by Saddam Hussein. And right now what we have is a repression of people, even in Iran, where the Mullah regime is oppressing not only the rest of its people, not only the other people that make up Iran, but the Kurds in particular. Look at what's going on with the Baluch, for example. Now, there are groups of people. There's an area in Iran where the vast majority of people are of the Baluch extraction. They would like their independence. They deserve their right to self-determination. And they're not only suffering from the oppression of Iran. And by the way, if we're going to try to deal with Iran, let's not ratchet up our military and threaten to attack them that way. Let's ratchet up our support for people like the Kurds and the Baluch and the Azaris and other people who live in Iran who don't like the oppression of the mullahs. And we can even be supportive of the Persian people who hate the mullah regime. These are not our enemies in Iran. It's the mullah regime, the fanatics that would drop a bomb on us and not even think twice because they think they're doing God's work. They're the enemy. So we need to be supporting, for example, the Baluch when I talk about in Iran, but the Baluch are also persecuted, mainly persecuted by the Pakistanis, who have them under their thumb, and they murder people constantly. They pick these young people up and they murder them, and then they drop their bodies in little villages just to show people what's going to happen to them if they try to resist Pakistani authority. But this is the history of Pakistan. Right now they're doing it to the Baluch, to the Sindhis, to the Singhs. You name it, you've got just a group of people, except for, of course, the Punjabis and the others who control, and Pashtuns, who control that government in Pakistan. Well, remember what happened before. We've seen it before. When the people of Bangladesh wanted to be a little independent of the Pakistani government, have some way to, control their own lives and control their own government, they were brutally repressed by the Pakistani government, and that's what led to basically the uprising of the people in Bangladesh when they freed themselves. But remember, that same type of oppression is continuing not only on the Baluch, but for example, the populations that came over from India after India and Pakistan split. A lot of them went to Karachi, and those people in Karachi now, there are people who want to have Karachi as like a Singapore of that part of the world, an independent. That's what they want to do because they have a right of self-determination. They don't want to be subjugated by this corrupt, militaristic, pro-terrorist government in Pakistan. We should be siding with people like that who want their independence and believe in these same values that we believe in. Another example of that, of course, is what we see in Spain today. Today, of course, now there are groups of people who live in Catalonia. Catalonia is a province with a long history in Spain. People identify themselves as Catalonians. Yes, Spanish, but also Catalonians. They should have a right to vote on whether or not they want to remain part of Spain. Whether or not do they give up their sovereignty to a central government in Madrid, or do they want to have a government of Catalonia that they can have their own government and, yes, their own sovereignty? Well, the Spanish overreaction to the efforts of the Catalonians just to have a poll. Basically, it was a vote on independence, but it was, basically it had to be recognized for it to have effect. But instead of letting them do this and just saying, well, it has no legal effect, instead, the Spanish government came down with brute force and conducted violence, as you would think violence coming from terrorists would exert on a group of people in Spain. It was their own government that was exercising violent and force and intimidation against the people of Catalonia. And now, of course, the people of Catalonia are united because they know the brutality and subjugation of what's going on with Madrid. Now, the British knew how to do it. Unlike Madrid and Spain, the British permitted their people in Scotland to have a vote. And that was a wonderful thing. The Scots had their vote. There was no interference. And if they didn't want to be part of Great Britain, they didn't have to be. And that was a wonderful example to the world of how you should do this. Now the Scots decided to stay part of England and part of Great Britain. That's fine. But they had their chance. The people in Spain weren't given that chance. No, instead, their government came down and beat them up when they tried to go to the polls. And let's say also the British seem to also be demonstrating they believe in self-determination. They are exiting, they're taking the Brexit issue of whether or not you should have Britain as part of the EU and the common market. That vote that they allowed their people to decide, it wasn't decided by an elite. The Brexit vote let all the people of Britain decide whether or not they were going to be basically part of a subjugated people in Europe, or whether they were going to be an independent force and a nation, which is their history as a people of Great Britain. And so I'm proud that they permitted Scotland to vote, and I'm also proud that they voted not to subjugate themselves to the EU and to the common market, etc. We need to make sure that we stay true to our principles and have a vision about what this world will be. If you're just looking at things of what we can do every day, Ronald Reagan succeeded because he had a vision of a peaceful world based on those individual rights and those concepts of freedom and democracy that were at the heart of the American experience, but also an America that encompassed people from all over the world. Reagan had a vision, and it wasn't to get into a war with the Soviet Union and destroy communism. Reagan's vision was, yes, we have to have strength in our military in order to defeat this enemy, of Soviet communism. And because it was threatening the world peace, it was taking over countries and overthrowing governments and replacing them with atheist dictatorships. Reagan knew we had to stop that. Just like today, our primary enemy today is no longer the Soviet Union, because Reagan helped eliminate the Soviet Union, the communist threat. The threat today is radical Islamic terrorists who will murder our people and are murdering people all over the world and murdering people in their own countries in order to terrorize them into submission. Well, the bottom line is Ronald Reagan's vision succeeded with Russia, because at that time it was the Soviet Union, and now we have a Russia that we have so much more potential. Now, there's a lot of flaws. There's a lot of flaws in the Russian government, and there are things that we have to make sure that we're taking care of and standing firm on. But by and large, we have to understand that they today are being attacked and murdered by radical Islamic terrorists as well. They know that and they know the dangers that we face, because they face a common danger. So we need to work to build a new alliance, because what's happening is Islam is making such inroads into the stupidity of our Western European allies that the Western Europe that we know, here again, time is going on. 19th century into the 20th century. Now we're in the 21st century. The 21st century will see that Europe becomes a whole different place than what it's been for the last 150 or 200 years. There will be Islamic countries in Europe, and they will be then either part of, or they will not fight against, a radical Islamic terrorist threat that today threatens the peace of the world, just as the Soviet Union did that 10 years, or should we say 10 decades ago. So with that, we need a vision. And one vision that we should have is, number one, a vision of self-determination, that we all agree on that. Number two, let's make sure that we ally ourselves in a positive way with people who are not going to be weakened by the onslaught of Islam. And I would suggest that America will be a more peaceful place, and our country will be more secure, and the world will be more peaceful and secure if we establish a new relationship in which we are watching out for each other with 4 countries. The United States, of course. The other one is India, and I will soon be going to India. In fact, I will be going to India tomorrow. And number 3, Japan. And number 4, Russia. Now, there is some work that needs to be done to make a coalition like that real. But a coalition of those countries working together, not mandated that we have to do this and we have to subjugate ourselves to decisions of what the 4 say, but instead seeking out cooperation with those countries where there is mutual benefit to do, we can make this a better world. We can secure our prosperity and secure the peace of our own country and the security of our own country. So with a vision and with a recognition of fundamental things like the right of self-determination and the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that our founding fathers talked about, and limited government, where they said government only derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. Let us champion these values and these ideals. Let us have a vision for the future, as Ronald Reagan did, and we can make this a more peaceful world as we side with people all over the world who want to control their own destiny by having their own nation rather than being subjected to someone else. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman have a motion?
I hereby do move that the House does now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. on next Monday.